So happy to have you all here for the launch of our winter 2015 issue of America's Quarterly on the new foreign policy in Latin America and the decline of U.S. power in the region. Before we get started, I want to give a big thank you to HSBC, who is a large supporter of America's Quarterly throughout 2015. Also to Telefonica, who is sponsoring our webcast. And so our friends from throughout the region and from throughout the globe can join us tonight for the discussion if you are unable to be here in person. And I want to give a big thank you to our distinguished panel of authors up with me on the stage tonight who wrote for this issue covering topics such as Russia's role in Latin America, U.S. policymaking in the region and the academic policy divide, and climate change policies in Latin America. You all have a copy of their full bios in your program materials, so I won't read through them. But with us, we have Diana Negroponte, who is a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We have Russell Crandall, who is a professor of American foreign policy and international politics at Davidson College. And then we have Guy Edwards joining us from Brown University as a research fellow and co-director of the Climate and Development Lab. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alana Tummino. I am a senior editor of America's Quarterly and the director of policy here at the America Society and Council of the Americas. So the plan for the evening, we have about an hour. We will have a moderated discussion among the panelists, and then we're going to launch right into a question and answer session with all of you guys. And for those of you watching via the webcast, you can submit questions to us via our Twitter at AmerQuarterly. And we're also going to be live tweeting throughout the event. The hashtag is on the programs you have, and the hashtag is LATAMFP. So tweet away. We won't take it as offense if you're on your phone, because we'll just assume you're tweeting about the event and not checking your email. So we're having this conversation this evening at a very interesting time in U.S. relations with Latin America. As one of the article points out, many view that the U.S., plagued by low growth, partisan gridlock, and the need to put out foreign policy fires elsewhere, places Latin America low on the administration's priority list, and that the country no longer plays this leading role in the region. At the same time, there are new trends of a new regionalism within Latin American countries, and that these countries are finding new trading partners across the globe. So I think to elaborate on this final point, I want to address the first batch of questions to Diana Negroponte. Diana, your article in AQ focuses on the growing attention of top-level Russian officials like Vladimir Putin and the Russian foreign minister in Latin America. And if you out there, you haven't gotten your copy of AQ yet, there's a wonderful illustration accompanying Diana's article. It was our creative director's choice, a funny illustration of Vladimir Putin with a tattoo of Latin America on his bicep, just really showing the increasing relations between Russia and Latin America. So Diana, tell us, what is Russia doing in Latin America? Is it political influence, trade, or military support? And given how contentious of a figure Vladimir Putin is and Russia's actions in Ukraine, are there any positive aspects of Russia's growing influence in Latin America?
Thank you very much, and thank you to American Society, Council of the Americas for the invitation to participate this evening on this panel. You have many questions wrapped up in that one paragraph. So let me first of all start with why I think there is this renewed interest on the part of the Russian leadership in Latin America. In 1991, Russia withdrew from many of the countries with which it had had close relations during the Cold War. The economic situation in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, changes in leadership resulted in a withdrawal into the body politic of Russia itself. And therefore, its extensive relations with Cuba diminished to practically zero. But beginning in 2000, that is 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia begins to resume its interest in Cuba. And its interest is based on aircraft sales. The Sukhoi and the Ilyushin aircraft, with an idea to create in Havana a hub through which aircraft would travel from Europe and Russia to the Caribbean, and through that hub to the islands of the Caribbean and to Latin America, South America, where a burgeoning tourist industry could develop. But that was not all, because closely attached to that was the role of Igor Sechin. Igor Sechin was Vice Prime Minister, soon to be head of Rosneft, a major Russian oil and gas company. And Sechin used his oil and gas connections to undertake foreign policy. Deals with Venezuela to acquire exploration rights, even though Russia itself has the largest gas reserves in the world and very important oil reserves within the Russian territory. Yet Sechin saw the opportunity to bid in the Orinoco Basin of Venezuela. Because not only was oil a tool of foreign policy, but there was the potential sales of equipment. The downstream potential for business, for Russian business in Latin America, was exploited fully by Igor Sechin, who spoke Spanish, who enjoyed interacting in the hemisphere with leaders, ministers of energy, and then, since you're Vice Prime Minister, leaders of the country. So you had this development not only of the aircraft industry through Cuba, but energy services through Sechin's personal diplomacy in the area. Then in the case of Argentina, there was the interest in investing in the development of the 3 nuclear plants, which Argentina was very interested in developing. And Russian experts came to offer their services, but they were not alone. Because when Russia was bidding on the upgrading of nuclear reactors, it is competing against General Electric, as well as the Chinese Nuclear Commission. And whereas the Chinese Nuclear Commission, CNCC, has significant sovereign wealth funds to support its activities, and General Electric has the means to be able to deliver the product, the Russian companies did not have the same credit guarantees as their international competitors, and they've lost those bids. But it showed an interest on the part of Russia to become engaged in nuclear energy projects, the upgrading of reactors, and displaying the technology which Russia has acquired and seeks to maintain. So what we saw during this period is, from a low base of $3 billion in two-way trade in 2001, by 2013, this has increased to $24 billion. Now, that is a major leap, but compared to Chinese investments of $210 billion, the $24 billion is still meager and got a way to go. It also coincided in 2014 with the sanctions imposed by Western Europe and the United States after the annexation of Crimea in, correct me, is it February or March of 2014, roughly 13 months ago. And shortly thereafter, the Russian foreign minister sets out on a journey to South America, which I can only describe as a make good friends. Because with both the European Union and the United States imposing targeted sanctions, and with the potential to increase both in depth and the number of sanctions against individuals, Russia needed friends. It needed friends for the trade that I've outlaid, but it also needed friends at the UN General Assembly and within the Latin American members of the Security Council. So there was a concerted effort beginning in March 2014, April 2014, leading up to the meeting of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China meeting in Brazil last summer. And on his way to the BRICS summit, Putin stops at various countries, Cuba, Nicaragua, Argentina, and consolidates or agrees on papers to commercial deals. Thus, the friendship would be underpinned by commercial agreements to the benefit of both the Russian suppliers and the countries of South America. My concern is the following. They're good on paper. How did I learn the details of these agreements? Because I read the press releases from Rostec, which is the Russian technology company, Rosneft, which is the oil and gas company, Bank, which is a major Russian bank, part-owned by the government, with their intent to prove to Russian citizens that they had friends and that there were commercial deals, and they were not alone in the face of these sanctions. So friendship mattered, but the reality of those deals remains, in my mind, somewhat skeptical.
And you mentioned China as well and the amount of investment that China has in the region. Can you elaborate a little bit more about other, beyond Russia, the relationship with Latin American countries and other countries around the globe in trade deals, in political deals, and what this means for the future of Latin American policymaking and what this means for the future of Latin America's relationship with the United States?
Alana, how many questions were wrapped into that? Let me just take part of that. The United States remains the largest market and the major investor in this hemisphere. What we have seen over the last 11 years is significant sales of raw materials to China. As China's economy was growing at 9 to 11% per annum, it needed the raw materials of this hemisphere, which were amply provided. But as China slowed down, so did the reliance on the exports of copper, soy, oil to China decline. And therefore, the need of governments within the hemisphere to develop alternative sources and not be dependent on any one market, neither the United States nor China. Europe was and remains a very interesting prospect market for the hemisphere, but European growth has been anemic at best. We're now seeing Spanish growth becoming very interesting at 2.4%, but it's been a rough 12 years in the European Union. And therefore, while there's a complementarity in exports and imports between the hemisphere and Europe, European market has not picked up significantly. Therefore, interest in looking at what India has to offer, particularly in high tech, as well as Russia. In other words, the hemisphere is open for business. It is willing to engage with partners that it might not have looked at in the 20th century when the focus was north-south. Now there is an openness to the south-south development. What that means politically is something that my colleague is going to address, so I do not want to rob your thunder. But we can talk about that further as we go on.
That's great. Thank you, Diana. And that's a perfect segue, I think, Russell, to you. And this question, again, I guess all my questions have multi-parts to them. But for you, in 2011, right after you left the Obama White House, you wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs titled The Post-American Hemisphere. So tell us, is what Diana describing, is this in line with what you thought the post-American hemisphere was? If not, what is it? And 4 years later, are we still seeing that, or what did you get wrong?
Sure. Thanks, Lana. And I just would first like to echo Diana in expressing my gratitude to the team here for all of the welcome and invitation that you all have provided me and provided us. It is interesting to think that in Latin America, the United States role 2011 now jumped forward to 2015 and what has changed and what has not changed. And I think that the 2011 post-American hemisphere was basically the idea not a novel one, but based on experiences during my short tenure in the Obama administration, that unlike the good old years, the region today was one where it operated apart from U.S. wants and actions. And so even though at times in the past that had been the case, it was never kind of systematically the case. And so Latin America, by and large, was in the diplomatic, political, economic orbit of the region. And I think that kind of sensing that this was no longer the case, and hence this post-American hemisphere. And I think when you just look at where the United States kind of has traditionally operated, as far away kind of in this kind of influence in Bolivia to Colombia, to the more traditional kind of backyard of Central America and the Caribbean, where it once was what the United States said mattered. And what was increasingly apparent to us is that at times we would say things and nobody was listening and nobody cared, or at least it appeared as such. And then the question became, is this a good thing? And what does this mean for the region? And if anything, my sense is that it will finally allow the region to act on its own terms. That so much of this dynamic of U.S., Latin America, I even think of the case right now of Venezuela, that kind of these extraordinary internal dynamics, whether you're on one side of it or another, but so often kind of the external view is filtered through Washington. And so both kind of U.S. policymakers and U.S. observers, but also kind of regional observers kind of see this as a dynamic that somehow has to do with the United States when perhaps it really doesn't. And that's why I think in some ways this recent episode with Venezuela and kind of the U.S. Sanctions and the way that the region has responded sort of brought at least me back to kind of an earlier time. It's not kind of post, that was very sort of pre in this dynamic. And so it could be the case that there are some in the region, especially those kind of who are traditionally opposed to U.S. policies, who have a lot to lose from the post-American hemisphere, because that inherent contentious relationship is no longer. But at the same time, getting beyond that isn't just a question, I believe, of the behavior and intents of these governments in Latin America or of Washington, but also just the way that the rest of us perceive it. That is, maybe it is a post-American hemisphere, and maybe Washington's acting in a way that's post-American. It's less interventionist, it's kind of consulting more, yet the press is caught in, so we still get kind of this reality, and I think I saw that in the press reports on Venezuela. It was sort of very kind of Cold War, very sort of, here it is, kind of U.S. slapping Venezuela, and then the region kind of responding en masse of dissatisfaction. And that could be the case, but it could also be something much more nuanced than that. It could be, and this is, I think, something that Enrique Krauss, put it much better than I could ever do so in the current issue of the New York Review of Books. If you haven't read it, it's sensational, a review of a couple of books on Cuba. But his point was that maybe with the Obama administration's moves on Cuba, that we are finally moving to not a post-anti-American hemisphere, right? That it was kind of waning, this anti-Americanism, and now it's dead. But just days after he publishes this piece, we have this apparent flame up of anti-Americanism, sort of that old tension. But again, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a tiny blip, but the way that kind of we've been trained to look at everything in the region is through this anachronistic, I could be totally wrong here, but this increasingly anachronistic lens. And I think lastly, there's a real opportunity for Latin America in this era, because when the United States is not kind of seen as controlling the events, that agency given to these actors that they deserve. And that's something that for so long, I think the mistake of US policy, kind of generation after generation, to assume that we could kind of fix these crises, that at some point, when push came to shove, that yes, they would kind of call the cavalry and they'd call the sheriff, and we would take care of it. And maybe part of the problem is that, to some extent, kind of these countries got used to that as well, in a kind of type of codependency. And that's why, if anything, I would have loved the Obama administration, whatever you think of how they responded to Venezuela, and I think this is what we had attempted to do. It's a lot easier said than done, but to do it in a way that won't kind of allow those that benefit from the prior dynamic to portray it as such, and that's exactly what happened. And so I think there might have been an unforced error there that kind of brings us back to the American hemisphere.
Interesting. And bringing this to the lens more of U.S. policy making in your remarks, given your piece in AQ, there's an excellent piece on the academic policy divide. And we had an interesting discussion before this as well, as it impacts a lot of other areas as well. So how have, in your opinion, scholars approached developments in the region related to this post-American theme?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it is a challenge for, if I'm going to critique the journalists who have kind of a Cold War lens at times, a residual Cold War lens, I think scholars, especially scholars of U.S.-Latin American relations, have the same problem, and that is, we need to hit refresh. We need to update, and think it's just a generational thing, but we're lagging behind these dynamics that aren't just, I remember there was I'm sure you've all heard it, but kind of an oft-told joke about, it goes something like, well, do you know why there were no coups in any Latin American countries today? And what's the answer? You can probably all do it in unison. Or that the U.S. embassies were closed, right? And then kind of, okay, well that, I thought you'd all heard it. Maybe I'm just a real U.S. Latin American geek. But in the idea, we chuckle like it's the U.S. role. But what we're learning is that there are times when maybe it's because the U.S. embassy was open that there's no coup. And it's just to kind of throw that out there, that it really depends. But if we have sort of our coup U.S. embassy lens on for looking at this, we're never going to get to that. And I think journalists need to refresh, and I think academics do as well. And that's where kind of another thing that I touch on in the piece is that just the idea of being on the ground, that these subtleties, kind of these new forces, the person in the the rancho or kind of the slum of Caracas, who hates Chavez, right, or vice versa, the rich in the country club areas of Caracas who loves Chavez. That's kind of, I think, some of what we're not getting at, because it just doesn't register with kind of our academic understanding and assumptions.
Right. And I think that's, again, a perfect segue to Guy, I think, especially in this scholar policy-making divide, especially as it relates to climate change. So how is what Russell's describing in terms of this schism between U.S. policymaking and scholar, as well as maybe a decline of U.S. influence in Latin America, how has this impacted Latin American countries' response to climate change and their response to the United Nations negotiations, as well as what policies they're taking at a national level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you very much for the invitation as well. It's a great privilege to be with two very renowned scholars on Latin America and global affairs, so thank you. Good evening to you all. I think I'd just start with saying that there's a clear link between the decline in US influence in Latin America and Latin American countries playing a more active role on climate change. And this really started to kick off in around 2008 when Latin American countries started to play a more active role at the UN climate negotiations. And since then, I think their role, which is very diverse, has really has taken off. And Peru hosted the annual UN climate talks in Lima last year, and was credited for really orchestrating what has been an incredibly difficult negotiation. And it's interesting that the US has really been a thorn in the side of the over 190 countries that participate in these talks. And I think Latin American countries, although they have a number of problems in terms of implementing these climate policies that they have been espousing at these global talks, they really have shown the US how to lead the way. And I think it's very interesting to put it in its historical context, in as far as that normally it's the US which is kind of bashing Latin America for corruption or not being democratic enough or coups or this, that and the other. But on climate change, Latin Americans are showing the US what to do. And it's only very recently that President Obama has been trying to make up for lost ground. And I think just to provide a bit of context on the negotiations, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, developing countries and developed countries are put in separate groups. So the Annex 1 countries, that's the US, Europe, Japan, and Australia, for example, and then the non-Annex 1 the non-Annex 1 group is made up of Latin America and other developing countries. And Latin American countries don't have a common voice at these talks. They largely kind of go their own way on particular issues. So you can see how Brazil has negotiated since 2009 alongside China, India and South Africa in the basic group. The ALBA countries, Venezuela, Bolivia and Ecuador especially, have been very vocal about climate justice and issues of historical responsibility, and essentially bashing the US and Europe and the other developed countries for causing this problem in the first place, and the fact that it's impacting their countries in the form of floods, melting glaciers, more intense weather events, a lot more than it is rich countries. So it seems rather unfair that they're being hit first and worst. And these Latin American countries have generally adopted different positions, but on a couple of things they do share a common voice, and they look at the UN climate regime as the principal vehicle to generate action on climate change at the global level. And they believe that multilateralism, a rules-based international system, and a legally binding agreement is key. And as many of you know, the United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which up until now has been the only legally binding agreement on climate change. So I think there we can see a rather clear schism between the two, well, North America and Latin America. But more recently, as I was saying, Obama is definitely trying to kind of bring the US up to speed. He's using his executive powers as far as possible to reduce US emissions, for instance, on power generation, fuel efficiency standards. And he's going to Paris this December. This is the kind of the grand finale, well, not the grand finale, but to some extent the grand finale to reach this new global agreement on climate change. So Obama's really trying to kind of bring the US round and play a more constructive role, which up until relatively recently it simply hasn't. Yeah, I think that's what I had for that.
No,
for
that's
that question.
great. Yeah, and I guess furthering that in terms of, you talked a little bit about the United States policy in climate change and how Obama has stepped up. Do you think that this is positive then in terms of United States relationship with Latin America as it relates to climate change, and what are the prospects for U.S. Latin America as it relates to this topic moving forward?
Yeah, I think just before I answer that question directly, I'll just throw in that Latin American citizens are a lot more worried about climate change than North Americans appear to be. And it's interesting that Latino voters in the US are also more worried about climate change than their North American voters. So just with the presidential election coming up next year, on that note, it just seems quite relevant. And it's interesting that there seems to be a lot less climate skepticism in Latin American newspapers and government than there is in the US. The Tea Party obviously springs to mind. James Inhofe with his snowball in Congress the other day when he threw it onto the Senate floor, claiming that climate change didn't exist. Look at all the snow that we have, which Obama described as rather disturbing. So I think that's quite a notable difference perhaps between the two. And I think it's important to point out that Latin American countries and citizens see this as a question of justice, particularly. As I referred to before, they didn't cause this problem in the first place. The historical emissions of these big industrialized countries have been obviously enormous. And it's unfortunate that the most vulnerable members of Latin American societies, such as indigenous people, women, are being affected. And I think Latin American leaders are, to some extent, responding to this, which you're not necessarily seeing at the ballot box or in political manifestos, but there does seem to be a groundswelling of concern about climate change, which is represented at multiple levels in the region. And in terms of I think US-Latin American relations particularly, climate change hasn't really featured very strongly between the US and Latin America. I think these geopolitical issues, traditional geopolitical issues such as Russia, China have, and obviously immigration in Cuba, have really dominated, and climate change has been a peripheral issue. But it seems ironic that in 2009, Obama launched his Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, which was broadcast as his flagship policy in the region. Yet it has achieved some advances and it has been relatively successful, but it's hardly appeared on the radar whatsoever, despite it being branded a flagship initiative. And it seems really a great shame. And that climate change hasn't featured more strongly, because it was only in September last year that Felipe Calderon launched the new climate economy report, which essentially said you can have economic growth, but you can tackle climate change at the same time and create prosperity for your citizens. And until now, that's really been the main problem with the climate debate, that policymakers, lawmakers are worried that you can't have growth, you can't have prosperity if you're going to reduce your emissions. But this report came out last year and has really kind of turned the discourse on its head and said, well, actually you can have both. And within the US Latin American context, just thinking about renewable energy especially, there's a real opportunity for US and Latin American cooperation on renewable energy, which thus far hasn't really been made the most of yet. And if we just think of Latin America's increasing energy demands, it's either going to be met by fossil fuels or it can be met by renewables. And there's a lot of research that points to the potential of small hydro, wind, solar, geothermal to meet this increasing demand. So there's no need to go down this kind of polluting road. And I think the US, given how technologically advanced some of its companies are, and there's a lot of expertise there that within US-Latin American relations really could be made the most of.
Good. We'll end on a more positive note, I guess, then in terms of a U.S.-Latin America relationship as it relates to climate change. I have a number more questions for our panelists, but I want to make sure that we have time to take your questions and questions from anyone watching the webcast. I will open it up to the floor to you all before I continue on with my questions. So please, I'll just ask that if you could please stand up and introduce yourself and then ask your question. And so, yeah, right here. There's microphones coming around. Oh, great.
Yes, hello. My name is James McDonald, and I'm here with a company called GenCap. And this is a question for you, Guy. We've seen massive drought in Brazil. Okay, so they're not quite victims because they cut down the Amazon, which affects massively the rainfall. So the question I have for you is, other than the devastating drought in Brazil, which doesn't seem to be ending, what other areas of Latin America or South America right now are suffering via significant climate change?
The question, I think firstly I'd just say that it's very hard to associate particular natural disasters or things that are going on such as droughts or floods with climate change. There's not always a direct link, but a lot of climate scientists would probably tell you that there is quite a high probability that they are, because if we just think of the increase in frequency and the intensity of some of these extreme climatic events, the correlation with increasing greenhouse gas emissions it's right there. I believe Chile has been suffering a drought now for at least the last couple of years. I don't know that many details, but I think it's been going on for a while there. Glacial melt is ongoing, which, as you all know, hydropower is the principal source of electricity for a number of countries in the region, especially in the Andes. So once the glaciers melt, this could affect millions of people. And I believe a Bolivian glacier that used to be the world's highest ski run melted away entirely in 2009. So the impacts of climate change are here today, and Latin Americans are saying very loudly and clearly that this is a grave situation which they're now living on not a daily basis. That perhaps sounds a bit exaggerated, but climate impacts are happening.
Great, thanks. I'll take one question here, and then I'm going to switch it over. We have a question from Twitter that I'll do next. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Juan Lechin. I'm a writer. And I have always the impression here in the States that the scope that American scholars and politicians have is an economic scope over the world. So the biggest analysis you do is based on that filter. Nevertheless, in the case of Latin America today, or for the last 15 years, it was clearly on the political analysis that already in 2003, Chavez was already going with the Cubans, with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the Ukrainians at that time. So I would like to comment if that mainly economical scope doesn't bias your analysis when you don't have, as a country, in general I'm talking, a political analysis as strong as the economic one? Could you comment,
Thank you.
please?
It's a fascinating question, and I would attempt to answer it by mentioning something that I wrote in the article. And that is, it is interesting that often when we look at the United States' involvement in the world, either historically or today, that for better or for worse, we default to a realist framework. So if it's, you can pick any example today, the United States vis-a-vis Putin over Ukraine, Eastern Europe, that kind of Putin has interests and pursues those, and we have ours, and that's just the way that the world works. But when it comes to Latin America, often we also kind of use an approach driven by emotion, driven by other factors, and the realism goes out the window. And I think part of that is sort of this a sensitivity built up over a lot of, mind you, historical baggage of the United States involvement in the region, but that kind of sometimes fear, sensitivities, and kind of guilt, what drives this approach is understandable, but it could also be erroneous. And I think at times it can also be quite unknowingly patronizing. And so, if we're going to give Putin his due as a statesman, we should do the same thing in Latin America. And that's not to somehow justify U.S. policy, but just to kind of realize, to acknowledge that the United States has interest and Latin Americans have interest, and that's just kind of, at times they'll overlap, and at times they don't. But it's like you get kind of sucked into the tractor beam of, is it the tractor, but the gravitational force in Star Wars? Right. Okay, so you can't, it's pulling you towards the Death Star, and you can't, my kids are 9 and we watched Star Wars last week, but you can't get out of that. Yet when we switch to Europe, when we switch to Asia, suddenly, okay, well, Beijing, boom, right? They have, and they do what they do, and we do what we do, and that's fine. And yet the Latin America, it's all mixed up. And I think part of that, sort of looking at that lens, and I think you're absolutely right that the economic, whether it needs to be more or less, kind of the economic has often been prioritized.
Thanks, Russell. Diana?
I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay, good.
One, there are two fundamental drivers of U.S. foreign policy. One is the economic, and the other is human rights. The Wilsonian drive to assert and to defend our values is very strong. So in the case of Venezuela, those who are opposing Maduro, those who are supporting the students and the trade union leaders and the political opponents are not doing it on any economic basis. They're doing it on human rights and the defense of democracy. And that is an equally strong tendency in U.S. political process and foreign policy process. The economic underlies it. It's always been there with our U.S. foreign policy towards this hemisphere. The trade went first. It was followed by the Marines, the flag. But it is counterbalanced in contemporary foreign policy by a very strong human rights assertion.
I actually agree with you. And let me let me clarify that one thing is driving U.S. policies yesterday and today, and then it's another thing how we react to it. And I think that's where kind of we jettison the realist framework. And so the reaction of the U.S. is through emotion and kind of sensitivities. When the rest of the world, we look at whatever the U.S. is doing in that kind of default realist framework. So.
Well, great, thank you. I'm going to take the question from Twitter. Thank you for tweeting your questions at us. So the question is, if Latin America finds new trading partners, but its exports remain mainly raw materials, What then for the region's domestic economic development?
May I have a go?
Please.
The countries of this hemisphere are making significant efforts to join value chains in increasingly sophisticated manufacturing goods. So as between Mexico and the United States, an auto part or an automobile will move across this border at least 4 times because we create part of the product in one country, develop it in another country, send it back for further development, and that is the way of integrated trade that's happening throughout this hemisphere. Yes, there was a very attractive market in raw materials, but the providers of those raw materials then saw that they were totally dependent on a foreign market, and when that market turned south, they suffered. So if you can move towards an integrated value chain in manufacturing, you have better control over your own development.
Great. I'll turn it back to you guys. Any more questions here?
I could add something.
Oh, please, yes.
To that. Is
Yes.
that okay?
Please.
Just thinking about Latin American economic development within the context of climate change, I think the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean has been very vocal about the need for obviously diversifying away from this reliance on natural resources. But I think it's worth emphasizing that this diversification needs to speed up or needs to at least reflect the fact that a number of sectors in Latin America which are key for their economies, agriculture being I think a key example, is very vulnerable to climate impacts. And in the case of Brazil, these droughts that we're seeing, and in other countries in the region as well, and there's a lot of debates about how yields might be affected by increasing temperatures, but there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that yields could potentially go down, and obviously droughts for the agricultural sector aren't good news at all. So if Latin American countries such as Brazil or Argentina are going to be this century major food producers and exporters, climate impacts do threaten those sectors. And I think, as we were saying before, with water scarcity, especially in the Andes, and the energy infrastructure as well, you can't really have development if you don't really have your energy. And I think that's an issue that's been very prevalent in Chile of late, that they can't build more coal power stations. There's much more potential for renewable energy. And obviously liquid gas is very expensive. So this kind of, not energy crisis, but very difficult energy challenges, I think it's worth bringing in the climate angle as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to follow up with a question actually to you on that of the region is such a large commodities exporter, and climate change plays such a role in that. So it'll be interesting, and as we talk about diversifying an economic base, I think climate change has a lot to do with that in terms of different products. Well, I'll take the liberty of asking, and I have a list of a couple more questions here. So I wanted to pose to the panel. We're in a new era of U.S.-Cuba relations right now. So I'd love to hear your views on the impact of these announcements, both from the U.S. and Cuba, and what does this mean in terms of the United States' relationship with the rest of the region, if anyone has.
Gallup poll on U.S. attitude towards opening the relations with Cuba came in at 59% support relations with Cuba. Every other poll that I've seen is up in the 60% of Americans supporting increased relations with Cuba. The government has started. It's very positive, but half the projects proposed will require financing and will require appropriations through Congress. the political process may make the realization of our opening to Cuba much harder than we would like.
Just to give a little context, when at the beginning of the Obama administration, we believed, I think erroneously, that kind of the key to success for hemispheric policy would be the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And at the time, it was right after I left the administration, but we were euphoric, thinking finally there had been so much criticism that we hadn't done enough for the region. We hadn't done enough for the region. What could we do? Well, we could do something that would be kind of a big lift politically. We could get the Colombia Free Trade Agreement passed. And then it happened. We celebrated and realized that the goalposts suddenly, it comes back to Cuba, that it really was. And at that point, the internal thinking was, yes, I think, from the president, we want to do something, but simple, legal obstacles make it very difficult, and what we can do, we've already done. So there's no there. But what was that quote of Madeleine Albright during the Kosovo War, when I think she was in London at a NATO meeting, and one of her aides comes in and says, "Madam Secretary, I know you want to get more airstrikes, but our lawyers say it's against international law." And she says, "Well, get me new lawyers." And I think President Obama got new lawyers, so to speak, with a much more aggressive interpretation of what it could do on its own. And it implemented that. And I think that was an extraordinarily deft and decisive move that we're still fully understanding. But and I think that is part of the president unleashed in these last couple of years, not worrying about re-election, and wanting to make this happen. And then the proof is in the pudding of how operationally it unfolds. However, I think politically speaking, that's less important. Whether we have an ambassador next week or it's a chargé, or it's still a relationship. And you can't, Marco Rubio or Senator Menendez, they can't take that away.
Right.
And I think maybe, when the dust settles, they'll, realize that, and we can move forward, especially if these poll numbers continue to demonstrate kind of broad American support for this move. So, it's an exciting moment. Now, whether, as Enrique Krauss was speculating, that it means once the president goes to Panama and kind of meets, it's the end of anti-Americanism, right? We were that close. Now we're back to in just one little. But my gut is that we are getting to a post anti-Yankee era. It's going to have little blips and kind of regressions, but I think overall, and that's a good thing for everybody. So.
Well, that's great. I was going to, okay. Well, it is, and there's two in the back. Okay, so we are reaching our hour. Let me take, maybe I can take one or two more questions here. We have one from Twitter, and I know we have a couple more here. So let me take one from Twitter quick. What does climate change mean for Latin American urban populations, specifically regarding water scarcity and access in major cities? So, Guy, I'm assuming this is for you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think we've seen with the drought in Sao Paulo, there's now the threat of water rationing, which is cropping up, and I think particularly the poorer segments of society are particularly at risk, and they're going to be suffering the adverse effects of this drought. I think this relates to questions of urban planning and infrastructure. I think in a number of cases, and of course this isn't only in the case of Latin America, but globally, urban planning has been quite a haphazard kind of undertaking, and I think a lot of these cities, especially in developing countries, where perhaps there's whole barrios or areas that aren't actually part of the official kind of city limits, don't have access to basic services. So I think this is quite an important question of environmental justice, and the fact that the more vulnerable elements in society are really going to be suffering if drought does affect or does increasingly affect urban areas, I think. Yeah.
And sure. Yeah. Just wait for the microphone, and then yes, I'll get to you. I'll get to you in the back there next. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Marcos Ribeiro, and I'm with Prisa, which is a media conglomerate. I am Brazilian. I go to Brazil on a monthly basis, and actually the droughts not only affected São Paulo, it affects from the state of Bahia in the northeast down to Rio Grande do Sul, the most southern state of Brazil. And it's not only affecting the poor population or the underserved population, the water being so scarce is affecting business and the most prominent and the richest areas of São Paulo, which is one of the 5 largest cities in the world, to the point that water is turned off at 2 p.m. and comes back at 6 p.m. on a daily basis. That's going to start in Rio in the next few weeks and in several other cities in the country. So it's not something that's only affecting the poor people or has to do with urban planning, because the reservoir that serves the city of São Paulo, it's outside São Paulo and is one of the largest reservoirs in the world. What we are having there is lack of rain, and that's what's causing the major drought. I wish it was urban planning, because then we would have engineers that could help us resolve the issue. But it's natural issues. It's natural problem that could be the global warming, and also could be things that are related to other type of damages that are happening to nature.
Thank you. I'm going to take one final question in the back, and then we unfortunately have to go, but we will have a half-an-hour reception after this, so people can continue to hopefully speak with you guys and have a glass of wine after this. And thank you to Diana, who has to leave us for another event. Thank you, Diana. So we'll take one last question before we break for the reception.
Hi, my name is Juliana Uribe. I'm Colombian. I work for Purpose in New York. My question is about the peace process in Colombia and the recently announced participation of the U.S. in the conversations of La Habana. I would like to hear your thoughts about the process and the participation of the U.S. in it. Okay. Thanks.
I think it is a good thing. To be present but passive in a way, and kind of healthy, as opposed to you go back. And Colombia is a good case in point of the way it used to be on very inelegant terms, a client state. I think of when in the 1990s, when the relationship between the United States and Colombia was narcotized. You had President Samper, the United States kind of sanctions Colombia. But if you talk to American diplomats at the time, they would readily tell you, okay, ultimately the Colombians are going to do what we tell them to do. They need our aid. This is, they revolve around us, and that's no longer the case. I think it's healthy for Colombia. It's healthy for the U.S. And now that Colombia is at this historic on the cusp of a historic achievement with the peace process, that the more that it is kind of Colombian orchestrated and Colombian owned, the better. And so I think the last thing that the United States, we kind of saw with Venezuela, just any type, even just the impression of kind of heavy-handedness or manipulation will play into that old narrative. So I think it's a good, modest step, and hopefully, if there's one, I know Diana just stepped out, but if you haven't read it, she recently published a fantastic book on the Salvadoran peace process. And one, as I'm sure most of you recall, that during the 1990s, you had this herding stalemate, and both sides wanted peace. And one thing that both the Salvadoran government and military on one side of the negotiating table, and the FMLN guerrillas on the other, concluded or acknowledged was that they came to trust the U.S. in the process. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that Bernard Aronson, who was President H.W. Bush's Assistant Secretary of State, who was deeply involved, met with guerrillas clandestinely during that Salvadoran peace process, it was tapped by President Obama to kind of take some of that, dare I say, magic to Colombia. I think the difference, though, is that, or maybe the good news for former Assistant Secretary Aronson, is that appears to be far less heavy lifting to be done, and so his role will likely be far less, and appropriately so.
Great. Well, thank you. And with that, we're going to conclude the panel, and I invite you all to join us at the reception. Again, a big thank you to our panelists here.